Today we're going to be looking at a tectonic hazards question, so let's jump right into it. Assess the importance of governance in the successful management of tectonic megadisasters. 12 marks. We've got to break this question down into its components. Assess is a trigger word. We need to focus on the importance of governance and talk about that in this answer, but also talk about some other elements which will have an influence on how successfully a place survives from tectonic megadisasters. A quick brief overview of the assessment objectives. We've got to make sure that we're putting accurate and relevant knowledge throughout our answer. We're referring to connections and making appropriate and logical ideas and information throughout. Also, we are coming to a judgment at the end, talking about the significance of the factors that we're going to talk about. When revising, it's always good to sit down and make relevant and appropriate notes. Make sure that you write the question down and then try to find the information that relates to it. Don't revise just generally looking through your textbook, making notes on key points. Try and use exam questions such as this one. So in this case, you've got the question above and I've laid out a table for you here. On the left hand side, I've identified the significant factors that could influence successful management, and these are governance broken down into three components: economic, political and administrative. So go away, make some notes on those three sections and how they do or do not influence or play a role in the successful management of tectonic megadisasters. And also, you might want to consider a completely different factor, such as the scale of the geophysical event. Now there are some theories that you can use like DEGS model or the PAR model, but also you can find out the influence of the magnitude or the intensity of an event, whether it's in a high income country or a low income country. How successfully can a country manage tectonic megadisasters depending on the magnitude or the intensity of the event? My suggestion would be go and make some notes now, and that will help you to structure a really good answer when you come to writing this in full. Now that you've made your notes, we can recap the key components of this question. Make sure that you are writing your answer in logical steps, you're able to apply your knowledge and understanding, and you address the question very clearly throughout the answer. Let's have a look at some introductory paragraphs. Governance is one of the most important factors in the successful management of tectonic megadisasters. However, international aid and scientific development also play major roles. This is a good start to an answer to this question because the candidate has identified the role of alternative things which could influence how successful the management might be. To make this even better, you might want to break down what governance actually entails or means, and give some examples of international aid or a specific scientific development that you might be considering. Here is another introductory paragraph. Tectonic megadisasters can be extremely catastrophic for the country they take place within. However, depending on factors such as governance of the region and social development controls, how successful the management of tectonic disasters are. So this candidate has talked about governance and maybe given a clue into what they might talk about. But remember, your time is short in the exam and you want the examiner to know that you know what you're talking about. It would be better to break down specific examples that you're going to refer to. You don't need to go into detail about them, but it shows that you understand that there are probably going to be multiple factors that influence how successfully a tectonic event might be managed. Here's another sample introduction. Megadisasters are large-scale events, often in their physical extent as well as having widespread human and economic impacts, meaning that in all cases they pose serious issues in the management and minimizing impacts. Although it could be said that in many cases governance does play a large role in reducing the overall impacts before, during and after an event, although this is not the only factor involved. This is a good start to a paragraph for this question, and again I would say that you need to break down and give some specific examples that you're referring to. It's correct that you're going to talk about physical extent, perhaps elaborate what you mean by that. Also, you might want to break down how governance plays a role, so you might want to refer to a specific element of it rather than talking about it from a general point of view. Here is a main paragraph that a candidate has written. The Japanese tsunami, which struck in 2011, was partially so disastrous because preparations had been made to modify the event and loss. However, these were insufficient. The sea defences constructed prior to the tsunami striking were too low for such a large tsunami, so were toppled relatively easily by the force of the tsunami and had little effect. Following the tsunami, the immediate response was efficient, giving aid to the higher seawalls were constructed, and a faster warning system was developed. This candidate has identified governance and talked about its components in this paragraph, which is very good. So for example, talking about the modification of the event and loss is good, but it could be improved further if the candidate had talked about the scale of the tsunami, how large it was in comparison to the walls and how tall they were. Although their evaluation is good. The candidate also talks about what was done after the event, although could have gone into detail talking about what kind of aid came into the country, whether that was domestic or whether that was foreign because of their relationship as part of a trade bloc or an international organisation. And when talking about the sea walls being constructed, perhaps a exemplification or more details provided for this would be good. With regards to the warning system, it'd be good to know what was developed and how that will help to reduce and improve the management of tectonic hazards in the future. Continuing on, the candidate writes, in a rapidly developing world where more people have mobile phones, a rapid disaster warning system has been set up, where a message is sent to every mobile phone in the region when there is a tsunami risk, warning people to get to high ground. Japan's governance for disaster prevention has or will have a major impact on the management of tectonic mega disasters. One thing that the candidate didn't talk about in the first paragraph was the scale of the disaster. How large was the event in terms of the Richter scale? How large was the tsunami wave that hit? And where did it hit? And what was impacted by it? In this second paragraph, the candidate is talking about the establishment of an early warning system. This is absolutely correct. And in fact, Japan has been deploying this for quite some time now. So in this paragraph, it seems that the candidate thinks that the warning system was set up afterwards, when in fact this had been set up in the process of. Another thing that the candidate could talk about in more depth in the last few lines is give some examples of other or alternative governance that Japan could deploy to improve and reduce the impact that tectonic events will have. It might be worth also mentioning that because Japan lies on the Pacific Ring of Fire, that actually managing tectonic megadisasters is extremely tricky because we still don't know when events are going to occur or where they're going to occur and the scale of what they will be like, making any form of governance or protective measures to certain degrees very vulnerable for a place like Japan. Here's another sample answer. However, governance is not the only factor. Another important factor is international aid, known as disaster aid, after a tectonic megadisaster. The immediate impacts of a disaster of this scale can be devastating. In 2011, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami resulted in 15,840 lives lost and cost over $210 billion in damages. The response of NGOs, public donors, and other governments are very important in the management of tectonic mega disasters, as these acts of public funding are needed for the reconstruction and readjustment to pre-disaster conditions. The candidate here has referred to specific facts and figures and the scale of the event, and has appropriately talked about international aid, although one could argue that it actually comes under governance. What would be better here is if the candidate talks about how quickly that international aid was provided, and perhaps giving an example of where funding was provided, how it reduced the impacts in the future. So perhaps using a different example would be better here, because you can see the comparative change with the event of a tectonic hazard that's occurred post international aid being given. Generally, countries are unable to support themselves. Even in Japan, following the tsunami, economic output was reduced by 5%. Further than that, more simple and more immediate acts of rehabilitation, reconstruction, and readjustment funds from international aid are also used to prevent such disasters from happening again. Since the 2011 Japanese tsunami, over 200 stations have been built at which seismicity can be measured to predict future mega disasters. Following on from the previous paragraph, some good statistics are given in this paragraph too, establishing the fact that the economy was reduced by 5%, but also international aid led to over 200 stations being built. What would be better is if this candidate talked about the impact that those 200 stations have had. In the past 10 years, there have been more events, and perhaps some discussion of how they have helped to reduce the impacts would show that successful intervention has resulted in better management and therefore less people being impacted by it. Next sample answer. Despite new innovations in technology, tectonic mega disasters are still totally unpredictable. This means that certain countries have to always be in a state of readiness for these types of potentially catastrophic events. However, even countries with highly developed prepared systems can be caught unprepared. This paragraph starts well because it's setting the scene for what the candidate will talk about and has already identified some issues when it comes to being prepared. A clear example of this is in the 2011 Japan earthquake and tsunami, resulting in the Fukushima disaster, its impacts costing over 200 billion, a lot of which could have been prevented if protection and disaster systems were maintained to the standard that they were expected to be. The ineffectiveness of the governance led to far greater impacts from the tectonic mega disaster, clearly showing the importance of governance in the management of tectonic mega disasters. A well-developed paragraph with key dates and examples given throughout. Even better would be to talk about the nuclear disaster that was as a result of the tsunami wave hitting the nuclear power plants, which would have then given even more credence to the fact that successful management requires a lot more than even what the higher income countries have in place already. Sample answer 7. Scientists play a very important role in managing tectonic mega disasters. However, rather than modifying losses, this is generally in modifying the event itself. Scientific risk mapping can help plot out where certain effects of a disaster will impact, and consequently preparations can be made to assist this. The candidate makes a good start here, referring to an alternative example with reference to this original question. Scientists are able to consider these and give advice accordingly for how responses should be made. However, they themselves are not the ones who input these calculations and consequent defences, such as to modify the event, vulnerability and loss, as this is instead organised predominantly by the local government. The point made in this paragraph is absolutely valid. but what would be better is referred to a specific example rather than a generic focus on how scientists can influence the situation. Final paragraph. Consequently, this means that scientists are not the most important factor in the management of tectonic megadisasters, as it is useless without governance. GNS Science, NZL, use LiDAR and other satellite and aircraft remote sensing data to create high-resolution pictures of the Earth's surface. These could not have been developed without scientists. However, they also would not have been used without governance. The candidate is making an accurate and relevant judgment in this paragraph, which shows that they have a deep understanding of the complexity of the relationships between lots of different actors and making sure that there is successful management. Next sample answer. However, it is important to take into account the location in which the disaster struck when it comes to managing a tectonic mega disaster, and also how powerful the disaster is. Haiti was decimated by the earthquake in 2010, which struck near the capital city, destroying key infrastructure and government buildings, which limits the effectiveness of the response. It also damaged the access to the area, so even if the government had an effective response plan, it would be very hard to carry out. This paragraph has seemingly got some important information in when it talks about key infrastructure being broken or destroyed, government buildings being destroyed. Certainly is correct. But it would be better to talk about the fact that in Haiti, there was no plan in place. There was no management plan to protect buildings or make them earthquake proof. There was no training for people to deal with the impact of an earthquake or what to do in the event of an earthquake. Perhaps talking about this in the immediate paragraph would give this paragraph greater credence, and also link back to the issue with governance, as in Haiti, clearly this had been lacking. Continuing on, disasters such as the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami also showed how some mega disasters can't be affected by good governance. This was due to the fact that there was very little warning, and also the widespread nature caused immense damage. Although good governance is important, in some instances it's impossible to successfully manage mega disasters. Absolutely relevant example to give here. However, lots of detail is actually missing. No examples of poor governance are actually well established in this paragraph. The Boxing Day tsunami also didn't just affect Indonesia, it affected many countries across the Indian Ocean. And so there could have been some discussion about the fact that there was no unified plan amongst those nations that were affected by it in the event that something like this might happen. Something that could be discussed here is also the scale of the event itself. Even if there were higher income countries in that region, would they have been able to reduce the amount of people being affected by it and also the damage to their economies? This is well worth considering in this paragraph further. Let's have a look at this conclusion. In conclusion, governance is immensely important in the successful management of tectonic megadisasters, as a national government generally has almost total control of an area. Even though international aid and the work of scientists and science are both very important, the government of a country has control over how these are used to manage the disaster, so consequently the extent to which it is successful. In this final conclusion, the candidate is coming to a judgment on the importance of governance, which is good. It could be improved further if the candidate talked about the finer details of government, i.e. the economic, political and administrative sides of governance, and how those three things working together can greatly affect whether there is successful management of a tectonic megadisaster or not. Having seen those previous paragraphs and answers, hopefully that's given you a better idea of how to structure and deliver the key points that you want to make. For assessment objective 1, you do need to talk about the large-scale impact, not only on humans but also the economic impact as well. Some discussion of how countries are trying to manage those situations, but also talking about the problems that are created by it too, would be important. Often candidates don't talk about an international approach to managing both short-term and long-term issues when it comes to tectonic disasters. For assessment objective 2, it's really important that you elaborate on key points and make sure that you understand the finer details of particular case studies that you may be referring to. Having a comparative before an event happened, during and after an event has happened will show or help you to demonstrate how countries are able to or not able to manage situations. One thing that's also clear is that there is a difference between higher income countries and lower income countries. A discussion about whether countries can afford prediction or prevention measures, but also how they can manage after an event and the consequences that this will have, will be really important too. Ultimately, writing a really good answer will require you to have a deeper understanding of what governance actually means, taking into account a pre-management strategy that has been put in place, what happens during and what happens afterwards, and perhaps some discussion of the differences between higher and lower income countries, as well as some discussion of a holistic approach or an international approach to help successfully manage these issues. Now, it's fundamentally important that you go and write your answer to this question. If you've just been listening to this, it will be helpful, and if you made some notes, that will be helpful too. However, if you're not actually writing an answer or writing a paragraph or a conclusion or an introduction to this question, you're not going to benefit much from it. So go and practice your writing, making sure that you are referring to the key points that we've discussed throughout this video. Make sure that you use words like because, despite, some, or but. Make sure that you're talking in your answer in the third person. The key thing is that you are writing clearly and neatly throughout. Make sure that you give good examples and refer to your notes. Make a note of this question, write it down on a piece of paper, and go and answer this question now. This will not only help you to revise the material, but also help you to practice writing so that you come across as a candidate who's speaking with authority. This is really, really, really important. So please take the time to write your answer now. It might take you half an hour, it might take you an hour. Use your textbook if you need to, use your notes if you need to, but go and answer the question to your best ability. And if you get stuck, go back to the previous components of this video, look at some examples that we looked at, and try to see if you can replicate or even improve on what was shared with you.